This interview, this conversation is becoming very interesting, sir, because there are so many highlights of understanding it. It's really pleasant to see you and your sense of humor and how you're putting things forth. But now we'll go on to a very serious matter, and that is the Russia-Ukraine war. So what, in your view, would constitute a victory for Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war? What are the red lines? Because you have, and I quote you, you have said very clearly that Russia will lay down arms only if Kiev's troops withdraw from territory claimed by Russia. Which parts would that be?
You know, it's not about victory, like you have said. The point is that Russia is determined, and will certainly do so, to protect its interests, protect its people living there, protect our traditional values, Russian language, and so on. Protection by the way of religion that has been cultivated on these lands for centuries. Yet you know that the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine is almost banned. They seize churches, drive people out of temples, and so on. It is a problem. And I'm not even mentioning the ban on the Russian language and so on. It is all part of a big set of issues. Let me remind you, we were not the ones to start this war. The West egged Ukraine on and supported the events orchestrating a coup d'etat. That was the point that triggered the events in Crimea, followed by developments in southeastern Ukraine, in Donbass. They don't even mention it. We've tried to resolve these issues peacefully for 8 years, signed the Minsk agreements, hoping that they could be resolved through peaceful means. But Western leaders openly admitted later that they never intended to honor those agreements, signing them merely to allow Ukraine to arm itself and continue fighting against us. After 8 years of relentless violence against our citizens of Donbass, something the West hasn't uttered a word about, we were forced to recognize these republics first, and secondly, provide support. Our special military operation isn't the start of a war, but rather an attempt to end one that the West ignited using Ukrainians nationalists. That's what is really happening right now. That's the crux of the problem. We will finish it when we achieve the goals set at the beginning of the special military operation, when we free these territories. That's all.
So what is that goal? What is the end game for Vladimir Putin in Ukraine?
I have said that already. Listen, we didn't recognize these self-proclaimed republics for 8 years. 8 years. They declared independence while we were trying to establish relations between the rest of Ukraine and those republics. But when we realized this wasn't possible, that they were simply being destroyed, we had no choice but to recognize them. And not just their existence on part of the territory, but within administrative boundaries established during Soviet times, then later under independent Ukraine after its independence, still within those administrative borders. And right away we told Ukraine, the Ukrainian troops, people don't want to live with you anymore. They voted in a referendum for independence. Withdraw your troops from there, and there won't be any military actions. No, they chose to fight instead. Now they have pretty much fought themselves into a corner. All this boils down to one thing. Either we take back these territories by force, or eventually Ukrainian troops withdraw and stop killing people there.
Just one last question, Geeta, before we move to the other one. Just one last question, sir. March 8, 2014, during the annexation of Crimea, you were addressing the Federation Council, and you said, Kiev is the mother of all Russian cities. What did you mean?
Here I haven't made up anything. Historically, this is how it was said. Originally, the Russian state was formed from several centers. The first capital, according to history, was in Novgorod in the northwest. Later, the federal status moved to the city of Veliki Novgorod, and then it moved to Kiev. This was ancient Rus, and since then, Kiev has been known as the mother of all Russian cities.
И с тех пор Киев называли мать городов русских.
Later, historical events unfolded in such a way that the ancient Russian state split into two parts. One part began developing with Moscow as its center, while another part fell under other countries. For instance, the part with Kiev, along with some other lands, these parts first formed a state with Lithuania, subsequently merged with Poland, forming the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Thus, this part of the ancient Russian state ended up in Poland, and by the 17th century, it sought to return back to Russia.
Right.
Geeta.
President Sir, the fact that, you're mentioning the history, and it brings me to what I did when the conflict was underway. I had traveled to Donetsk, I traveled to Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and most of the people over there are Russian speaking. They speak Russian language. They were very disappointed with Kiev that it was banned in eastern Ukraine. But they were also a little shocked that how is Putin doing this to us? We are his people. A lot of women I spoke to were in shock. So what do you have to say to people in eastern Ukraine who actually have families in Russia, who on a daily basis move from Ukraine to Russia? So what do you have to say to them?
The answer is quite straightforward. These individuals presumably resided in those parts of Ukraine, specifically in the areas of the Lugansk and Donetsk region, that remained under the control of the Kiev authorities at the time. Meanwhile, that part of the Lugansk or Donetsk region outside their control was being subjected to intense military action by the Kiev authorities. We were consequently forced to extend support to those areas that had declared independence. That is the first point. Secondly, we provided people with an opportunity to express their will in an open referendum. Those who believed it was in their interest to join Russia voted accordingly. Those who did not were free to leave unhindered for other parts of the Ukrainian state. We have never placed any obstacles in the way of that choice.
So what do you make of President Zelensky? He was promised NATO. The European Union promised him EU. Nothing really happened. Was NATO ever on the table for Ukraine?
When this gentleman came to power, he declared that he would pursue peace at all costs, using every means possible, without sparing even his career. But now we see things differently. He follows the same pattern as his predecessors, putting the interests of a narrow nationalist group, particularly radical nationalists, ahead of those of the people. Essentially, he is addressing their concerns rather than those of the nation. This regime's mindset truly resembles a neo-Nazi regime, because extreme nationalism and neo-Nazism are almost indistinguishable concepts. Today, undeniably, military action dominates their approach. However, they haven't achieved much success here either. I have already said before that what matters most for them is realizing that the best way to resolve the problems is through peaceful negotiations. And we attempted to negotiate with them back in 2022. What exactly they plan to do remains to be asked from them directly.
That'll be interesting to see what they have to say on that and how this peace process goes forward. But sir, you've always said that the eastward expansion of NATO is your real concern. Now, Ukraine hasn't got this NATO membership as of now. My question to you, sir, is NATO expansion the real threat or just a pretext for what you think is a part of Ukraine which is probably you want control over, or you think that injustice is being done, Russian language is being banned. These were the real issues.
Послушайте,
Listen, NATO is another matter altogether. The Russian language, Russian culture, religion, and even territorial issues. These are very important topics. One subject. NATO is something entirely different.
здесь мы не
We don't demand anything exclusive for ourselves here.
Во-первых, есть общее решение, согласно которым
First of all, there are general agreements that the security of one state cannot be guaranteed by undermining the security of others.
теория не очень понятная.
This idea might seem somewhat obscure, but I'll explain it simply.
Вот говорят, что каждое государство,
Each country, including Ukraine, has the right to choose its own means of defense and ensure its own safety. Correct? Absolutely correct. Do we deny Ukraine this? No. But it's not acceptable if done at Russia's expense. Ukraine believes it would benefit from joining NATO. And we say, that threatens our security. Let's find a way to secure yours without threatening us.
нам угрожать не обеспечит вашу безопасность, но и нам угрожать.
Secondly, we're not asking for anything unusual or unexpected, nothing falling from the sky. We're just insisting on fulfilling the promises already made to us.
Неожиданно и упало с небес. Мы просто настаиваем на том, чтобы были
These
исполнены
weren't
данные
invented
нам
yesterday. They were pledged to Russia back in the 90s. No expansion eastward, this was stated publicly. Since then, several waves of expansion took place, culminating with Ukraine being drawn into NATO.
После этого состоялось несколько волн расширения и добрались
This completely displeases us and poses a serious threat. Let's remember that NATO is a military-political alliance, and Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, establishing NATO, hasn't been repealed. It's a threat to us. Nobody bothers to take us seriously. Lastly, when Ukraine became independent, few people recall this, what was the first document ratifying independence? It was the Declaration of State Sovereignty, Independence of Ukraine. That forms the foundation of Ukrainian sovereignty and modern statehood. And it clearly states that Ukraine is a neutral state.
Was that also the basis for what happened when you decided to annex Crimea, your only warm water port, a very important strategic port for Russia, and then Russia was no longer part of G8. Today, the West claims or says that your actions in the recent past is the reason for, and I quote unquote, the isolation of Russia.
We didn't need to seize that important port in Crimea because it was ours already.
Потому что он был наш. Наш военно-морской флот по договору с Украиной.
Our navy had been stationed there under the agreement with Ukraine, which is a fact.
Это по факту.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union, our fleet remained there regardless. The matter isn't about that, though it's significant, but that's not what we're talking about here.
И мы не аннексировали Крым.
And we did not annex Crimea. I want to emphasize this point. We simply came to help people who didn't want their lives or fate tied to those who staged a coup in Ukraine.
Они сказали, ага.
They said, hey, nationalist extremists took over in Kiev. Did anyone ask us? Okay, we ended up as part of independent Ukraine after the dissolution of the USSR. So be it. History happened like that. Fine, okay. Now we'll live it that way. But we believe that we exist in the democratic state, and if coups happen here with unknown consequences, then we won't accept that. We don't want to live like that.
Мы с этим не согласны. Мы не хотим так жить.
there was a threat, not just of pressure, but of outright violence against Ukrainians. Russia stepped in to help them. How could we do otherwise? If someone believes differently, thinking that Russia would act differently, they're deeply mistaken. We'll always defend our interests and our people.